Well, with us today is Keith Findlay, and he's going to be helping by arranging the bicycles and holding them and so on. And what he's holding at the moment is the frame of a 1930s grub recumbent. When Alex was first looking at the design of bicycles, he considered various riding positions, and experiments were carried out with a recumbent to see whether the recumbent position was going to be better than the classic position. As we all know, he eventually rejected the recumbent position, but this is an important machine or frame of a machine from that period. Also with me today is my wife Rosemary, and she's got here the bike that really got Alex thinking about bicycle design in the first place. This is a Curly Hutchins which he bought during the Suez crisis when fuel was rationed in the UK. A very nice classic lightweight, one or two slightly individualistic features about it. Of course, specifically, we've got the curly stays at the back, much beloved of many enthusiasts on the basis that they are believed to give a little bit of resilience to the ride. Very much disputed. Other people unkindly say that it's an expensive way of adding a pound to the weight of the bicycle. But whichever way you look at it, the Hutchins is a very, very nice lightweight machine, and this is the standard against which Alex started to evolve his design. Now what Keith is showing us here is the first Moulton bicycle frame. This was the monocoque, made out of 22 gauge duralumin sheet in 1959. Extremely rigid, open frame, weighing about 5.5 pounds, and you can see the riveted construction. Let's go in a little bit closer on that now, and you can see a little bit of the sort of detail there of how the thing was put together. This machine, when it was built up, had front suspension but not at the back. Went quite well, was allegedly quite noisy. Give it a tap, Keith, and we'll hear the sort of yeah, you can imagine what that might have sounded like coming down the street. But it was the start. Very early monocoque design, arguably the first, at least of this particular type, and an interesting stage in the evolution of the Moulton. This next machine is much more like the Moulton of the 60s that we all knew, and in fact is very close to the machine shown in the original Moulton patent drawings. This prototype dates from 1960, and you can see most of the characteristics of all later Moultons in there. The open frame, the multi-adjustable unisex aspects of the frame, and the suspension front and rear, with small wheels and plenty of space over for luggage carrying. But a number of the details are of course very different. So again, if we have a look in a bit more detail, zoom in there, let's have a look at the rear triangle, so to speak. And here you can see that we've got a rubber block suspension, and we've got a rear trailing arm which has very small diameter tubes. Let's zoom in a little bit closer there, and you can see that you've got the sort of size of tube there which was later to be used by Alex in the space frame Moultons. It was something which was a bit of an evolutionary dead end at this time, because as we all know, the solution that was adopted on production Moultons was rather different. But you can see that the idea of using thin diameter tubes, which again is echoed at the front end, was present. And look again at this front end suspension. Here we've got a leading link with rubber in compression in a clapper box arrangement. Very different from what happened in the production machine. And again, nonetheless, very much part of the Moulton pattern of front suspension, which was to be conserved on all later designs. What we've got here are a couple more evolutionary designs from the late 50s, early 1960s. Keith's holding here an experimental Moulton which was very much used to get the steering geometry right. So if we zoom in, for example, onto the steering head here, you can see that there's a quadrant device which allows the steering head tube angle to be altered for experimental purposes. And if we look down at the bottom, you can see there's a slider where the front axle is attached, which enables the wheel to go back and forth to get varying degrees of trail. So a machine very much for experimenting on, not a finished piece of work at all, but a mobile workshop, if you like. Now if we swing round to this machine here, this is really rather an elegant beastie. This has a fairing designed by Pininfarina. Now Farina, of course, was very much involved with the styling work for BMC motor cars at the time, with which Alex was also involved on the suspension design side. So here from the studios of Pininfarina in Italy is this aerodynamic and also weather protecting device on the front of the machine. Very elegant machine, generally like the one that was featured in the patent drawing, the machine we saw a couple back. You can see the same sort of front and rear suspension, and in this case, of course, an early example of the large Moulton rack which we were to become very familiar with. You can see the way it's fitted into the extension of the small carrying handle cum top tube, and in this case is detachable. Here's a little view inside the museum itself, where you can see the Hetchins in the background, followed by the monocoque frame, then the variable head machine, a rather nice machine with fairing and basket on the back of it, the Pininfarina faired prototype, the one very similar to that which was featured in the patent, which we saw outside, and another similar variant. You can see really that there's a progression there from the Hetchins inspiration through to something very similar in concept, though not in detail, to what actually went into production. What we're now going to do is to move on to the production phase and the later prototypes that led up to that. Well, by 1961, the prototypes were getting very much like the sort of thing that was put into production. And here is a late prototype from 61. You can see a lot of the characteristics of the production models, right down to the billiard cue device, which was an optical trick to offset the possible worrying effects to potential purchasers of the long cantilever seat tube and head tube. But there are still some subtle differences. If we zoom in, for example, to the front suspension there, you can see that the directional control from the steerer is provided by a hinge arrangement, rather like the sort of thing you see on the undercarriage of an aircraft. That was, of course, later to be replaced by nylon steering splines, or rather metal splines in a nylon bush. Now, if we look at the rear suspension, again, a simple kind of clapper box arrangement, not quite as sophisticated as that which was used in the final production. But there you can see a basket, again, something which appeared in slightly different form on the production models. And all in all, as we step back and look at the whole thing in totality, not a million miles removed from the production deluxes which we saw in the 1960s. And on that theme, Keith over here has just such a machine. He's going to wheel it over for us to have a look at, and this in many ways is the archetypal Moulton of the 1960s. A billiard cue deluxe with the amber wall tyres based on the Dunlop Sprite, front carrier to carry 20 pounds of luggage, rear carrier to carry 50, unisex frame, and Sturmey Archer 4-speed. Really a very nice example, highly collectible, and the machine that did so much for the cycle industry over here. Well, the Deluxe, which we were just looking at, went on the market with the other early Series 1 machines in March 1963, but of course the machine was launched late in 62, and in December 1962 a significant event occurred, the breaking of the Cardiff-London record by John Woodburn. This is the machine that John used, and it's very much a standard Moulton frame as used in the Series 1 production, from which the carrier beam has been sawn off, lightweight components have been fitted. You've got the big chain wheel there, which we'll zoom in on now. Quite a nice little beastie there. And that was driving a Sturmey Archer FC close ratio 4-speed, actually a 1958 one, because by this time those had gone out of production. Now you can see some very tatty looking tyres there. That's the process of time, decay of the best part of 40 years on very thin tubulars. These were nominally 18-inch tubulars, but of course tubular sizes date from the time when tubulars were about 1.75 inches in diameter, and they'd shrunk down to rather less than that, so the real diameter was about 16 inches. And those were obviously the format used on the early racing Moultons. So let's go wide angle again and see this rather nice machine. This was ridden in very adverse conditions. It was in December. John Woodburn was then a 25-mile champion, and he ended up riding 162 miles. It was done on a hub gear. It was a small-wheeled bike. It had suspension. The experts said it was a rather silly thing to do, and yet it knocked something like 16 minutes off the record. Really quite an achievement. And that was something which very much helped the promotion of the Moulton in the early days. Now, we're not going to go through every model in the Moulton range. That would be rather boring, I think, but a very significant model or sub-range was the stowaway. And this is a rather nice example, the S stowaway, which was fitted with lighter weight components. Of course, the whole thing about the stowaway was that it took apart for stowage in the back of a car or on a yacht or whatever. And you can see that there's a break point in the middle of the beam. At least you can if we zoom in a little bit. Here we go. There is the brake joint, which was operated by an Allen key and allowed the two ends of the bicycle to come completely apart. Now, this particularly nice example here of the S range, which was built in or assembled in a separate works in Bradford-on-Avon under the direction of Jack Lauterwasser, this one is chromium plated, which was an optional extra, and it does look rather elegant. You can see it's got the narrow section high pressure tyres. These were derived from the tubulars in the sense that the braking radius of the rim is exactly the same as the tubular to enable people to interchange between high pressures or tubs. And that's the origin of what is now the 17-inch Moulton format. In those days it was called 16 by 1 1/4, and these are the very rare amber wall tyres from that period. You don't see many of these around anymore. And you can see that the rubber is tending to break down a little bit. Well, for heaven's sake, they're 35 years old or so. You can't really grumble about that. But there we are, very nice, relatively lightweight stowaway from the period, and it's fitted with the Duomatic 2-speed coaster brake. You can also see, if we zoom in again, that the carrier comes off completely. There's a quick release handle underneath, and the carrier with the bag can be taken off and stowed away in the boot of the car. Now, panning round now and going wide angle again, we've got Keith here with another significant model from the early range. This is the Safari, the touring variant. Lightweight transmission, Sturmey Archer 4-speed again, although there was an option to add on a derailleur as well to give you 8-speed, so 2-speed derailleur with a 4-speed hub. An extra large rear bag with side pockets. This was expandable upwards so that you can see there's a deep flange around the top, so you could expand the height of the bag, and it also had loops on the top. Let's see if we can pick them up here. Yeah, there we go. Loops on the top to tie on a tent and things like that. Extra luggage. At the front, a similar sort of bag, again expandable upwards, and the front carrier, and bottle cages either side. Aluminium mudguards on this particular one. That is the Safari, the definitive Moulton touring bicycle of the mid-1960s. While we're looking at this stowaway here, we'll just zoom in on the rear suspension a little bit, because of course one of the differences between the early prototypes and the production versions was that the rear suspension element, the rubber, is not just in direct compression, it's in shear and compression at the same time, because it's got a radius to it. You can probably just see a slight curve, but that's offset from the radius of swing of the rear arm. You see the pivot bolt in the centre of the picture now. So what happened was that the rubber was squeezed and sheared at the same time, and that gave it an increasing rate. In other words, the rate of spring, to put it in crude terms, got stiffer as the load increased, and this was self-compensating. It's one of those reasons why with an early Moulton you never seem to hit the stop on the rear suspension. It's a very nice characteristic, and in many ways the heavier you load them, the better they ride. Just now we were looking at the rear suspension of this typical Series 1 or Series 2 Moulton. That particular one we were looking at was Series 2 because of the straight rear fork blades. Now we're looking at the front. Very similar on all the Series 1s and 2s, and indeed on the Mark III. But you can see this bellows here, and Keith is now going to roll the bellows back, seductively revealing the splines inside. You can see the metal splines. Let's see if we can get a little bit closer in there. Now this is what gives the steering direction. These splines go up and down in a nylon bearing, and all kept clear from grit by the rubber bellows. Now Keith will clip that back up, put it into place, and we'll then demonstrate roughly the amount of travel you get on the thing. There you are. Quite a significant amount of cushioning. Now, as we pull back from this shot, we'll see that what we're looking at is the famous Molten Speed 6. This was the production racing machine from the mid-1960s. The first bicycle to be sold in the UK, production bicycle to be sold with a 6-speed derailleur, possibly the first in the world. Nobody has ever shown me any evidence of an earlier production 6-speed derailleur. Very nice machine indeed. Based on the same frame as all the other early Moultons. It's got a Series 2 rear suspension, and if we have a closer look at that, you can see something rather unusual about the derailleur, in as much that it's mounted ahead of the rear axle. Not totally unique, but quite unusual. And this is in fact a specially modified by Moulton Cyclo P2 derailleur with a 6-speed block. Very much the cutting edge of derailleur design at that time. Nice big aluminium chain wheel there. And going up the frame a little bit, we've got the removable carrier, because this machine could be toured, or you could take the mud guards off and you could take the whole of the carrier beam off. Rather more comes off than with the stowaway. And it became then a very useful bike for time trialling. Vic Nicholson, for example, won 15 time trials in 1 year on one of these machines, which is quite an achievement. The only thing unauthentic about this machine that springs to mind is that in fact the wheels have been changed for the standard 16 by 1 3/8 instead of the 16 by 1 1/4. But all in all, a very nice example of the Molten Speed 6. Apart from the main range of Moultons produced in the 1960s, there was also the 14-inch wheel variety. This was a 7/8 scale version of the original Moulton and was really targeted ergonomically at the typical Western female. Most of the competitor small-wheeled bicycles that came out in competition with the Moulton, inspired by it, were again targeted at women rather than men, size-wise. And so this was produced based on a 14-inch wheel rather than a 16-inch wheel. These machines stayed in one form or another in production for quite a number of years. When Raleigh took over, they produced this one. This is the Minx, a 3-speed version with adult fittings, which will suit an adult up to about 5'8" in height. The original 7/8 scale Moultons came out in the mid-60s, about 1965, 1966, but they carried on in production until 1974 when Raleigh stopped making them, although a lot of the later machines didn't have front suspension and were rather inferior. Now, we've looked at a lot of bicycles and we're going to look at a lot more later on, but let's break things up a little bit now by having a look at something unusual. Now, this may look to you like a perfectly ordinary 1960s Moulton, apart from the fact that it's lacking some rather vital components and would be just a little tricky to ride. But if we walk around it and have a look at the other side, we can see that there are some quite significant, interesting features about it, not the least of which is the fact that the suspension is cut away here, so you can see how the thing is put together. And this is a really rather nice example of a cutaway Moulton. There aren't many of these knocking around, but let's zoom in a little bit more detail on the front. Now, we saw a few minutes ago when Keith revealed it to us, the front suspension. Here you can see what's going on inside, the main steel coil spring with a rubber column inside, and you can see the nylon bush there. Then you can look a little bit higher up, see the frame junction between the main beam and the head, right up to the top, and you can see a little spring at the top with tighter windings. That's the Rebound Spring to allow the suspension to go down lower than the normal rest position when it's bouncing back from shock, and way up into the top of the head tube there and the top race. Now, if we go down the bike and along the main beam and down to the bottom, have a look at the rear suspension. Now, there you can see, let's see if we can reposition this. This is all being done on the fly, totally unscripted. But there you can see the rear pivot, section through the rear pivot, and you can see that rubber suspension medium with its displaced radius. See the suspension pivot there at the bottom left of the picture? The suspension is moving in quite a different arc to the way the rubber is disposed, so that it's being sheared and compressed at the same time. You can also see a bit of the construction there of that rear trailing arm. And let's just move back a little bit, see it all in context there. So a nice little look there at the inside workings of the original Moulton suspension. The last of the line of the utility Moultons of the 60s and 70s was the Mark III, and this was a variant produced by Raleigh. The design work was obviously in conjunction with Alex, but the main difference here is the rear suspension. If you look here, you can see the triangulated structure, which was used on all subsequent production Moultons. There's a little squash ball up at the top. If we zoom in there, you can see fairly simple rubber ball which provides the suspension medium. And you can also see that the carrier is detachable. There's a bolt there just above the ball. Again, panning back, you can see that the whole carrier is removable, which is something which wasn't generally a feature of the 1960s Moultons. If we walk round the bike, you'll get some kind of idea of the general shape of the rear carrier. You can see that sort of V configuration of the two middle members. Again, that's echoed in the space frame Moultons later on. And it's worth just looking down at the gear here, because this was the small diameter hub brake 3-speed, the S3B, which was brought out by Sturmey Archer specifically for small wheel bikes. It was also used on the Mark III RSW. Not the most effective of hub brakes, it has to be said, and some problems with oil seals, but an interesting design. Well, at first glance, this machine here looks a little bit like a Mark III. It's got a triangulated rear end, but of course, if we look closer, we find that it is unsprung. This is that most rare of creatures, an unsprung Moulton bicycle. And this was evolved specifically for track racing. Alex would concede, I think, that there is one place where suspension is unnecessary on a bicycle, and that is on a smooth racing track. So here, for the sake of it, was a nice lightweight racing Moulton with a very low and rather futuristic position, considering the time when this was produced. In the 60s. Very, very light. Keith is going to lift it up with one finger now. He is insured for this purpose, but you can see that it is really a pretty light bicycle. That's the experimental unsprung Molten Speed. Now looking at something more mainstream, but again rather unusual. You may remember, if you're of a certain age, that there used to be a thing about looking for 1936 pennies, was it, or was it 1933? Anyway, there was a very rare issue of the penny which was supposed to guarantee any schoolboy's fortune if they found it. This is the equivalent in Moultons, the S-Speed. Only a dozen or so were produced. Very much the same sort of general concept as the other Moultons, but the detail again is different. Built out of Reynolds 531. The principles of construction are rather similar to those of the 14-inch Moulton. Instead of tapered tubes, you've got straight-sided, parallel-sided tubes with edge braze construction and a simple clapper box rear suspension at the back. Let's zoom in on that. Now look at that transmission, isn't that rather tasty? This is a 12-speed with a heck of a large chain wheel, 72 or 74 tooth, something in that order. And this, in fact, is the machine that was used by Vic Nicholson, one of the great racers who used Moultons in the 60s. Vic used this machine when he broke the Cardiff-London record. Now, this was a different Cardiff-London record to that broken by John Woodburn, because by this time the Severn Bridge had opened. And so this was Vic Nicholson breaking the record, which had been set by a conventional machine, by about the same sort of margin, another quarter of an hour or so taken off the record. This very nice, lightweight Moulton S-Speed. After Raleigh stopped producing the Moulton Mark III, Alex decided that he would like to go back into production himself, making machines suitable for connoisseurs, and with Raleigh's agreement, continued development. Now, originally, he was going to do something like this. This is a Y-frame, his personal machine. Very, very nice machine. So you can see that the theme is continued from the Mark III with a similar sort of triangulated rear suspension. But instead of the main beam carrying through, as in the others, you can see that there's a split into a Y configuration. Very nicely marked up with his name there as well. Nice bit of sign writing there. Now, this machine, Y-frame, was very nearly put into production, but there was a comment from a friend of Alex's about the weight of it. It wasn't excessive, but there was a feeling that something better could be done. The machine could be made lighter, and it was that comment that led to the evolution of the space frame Moultons. So we now make quite a major change from the end of this particular line of development to something rather radical. So the manufacture by Raleigh of Moulton bicycles finished in '74, and from that time onwards there was this development of frames, different materials. So we're going to see a very rapid parade of these now. Here, for example, some alloy frames with their weights marked on them, and as you go past you can see the dates on some of these, March 75, March 76 and so on. All sorts of different forms of construction, oversized tubes, different types of frame couplings and so on. And eventually, in '77 came the breakthrough. And there you are, June '77, the space frame concept had been evolved. Now, on this particular one, you can see that it's made up of angles with an infill of rod or wire in between. And from June '77 onwards, this type of construction was evolved in many different variants until it evolved into what became the production model. You can see a whole range of different types. They're all subtly different. And here's another view of some of those space frame evolutionary models. What we're going to look at now is a parallel development with the suspension. So if we pan up here to this shelf, you can see a whole selection of suspension units from the 1960s through into the 70s. And from the mid-70s you can see that there's a big change to a leading link form of suspension with a stirrup and a spring inside the steerer. Lots of evolution on those particular types, many subtle variants. And there was a parallel development with the sourcing of tyres, because Dunlop had destroyed the moulds from the originals, so another source had to be found, and that was Volba in France. Pirelli were also tried, but Volba were the people who got the contract. And as you can see here, a whole set of samples and reference copies, references from the original Dunlop type through to different types of compound used in the Volba prototypes. Des Isley, who used to work at Bradford, used to cycle over to Soissons in France and ride the new ones back. So there was a real hands-on testing of the various rubber compounds. So here we are with an actual production AM from 1983. This is an AM2, and we'll walk around it so you can get a better idea of the three-dimensional nature of the thing. Let's come in closer and look at that frame now, and you can see the way it's put together with the two main cross members, lattice beams, tied together at the base, and with a kingpin through the middle which allows the frame to separate out. So there we are, that's the AM2, one of two original models. There was the AM2 intended for town use and the AM7. And about the only thing that isn't original on this particular model is the little day carrier at the back. Now what Rosemary is holding up here is a piece of paper which comes from Jim Glover, who was the Canadian national coach, and on this he's put down the statistics for his AM7. Now the AM7 was of course the other model from the original AM range, and there's some pretty fantastic stuff here. He got the bike in 1987 and passed it over to Alex in 1995, and during that time he did 56,249 kilometers, which is something else. And there's some pretty amazing statistics as well. His fastest ever downhill was 86 kilometers per hour, which is about 54 miles per hour. Fastest on level ground, 70 kilometers per hour. Quite amazing stuff there. A well-worn bicycle which has done very good service with somebody who can really go. Because when you look at his fastest cadence, we've got there, what is it? 237, I think I'm looking through somebody's arm here. Let's get the focus a little bit better there. 237 RPM. Well, that's pretty good going. And here indeed is the machine in question, this much travelled, well-worn winner. Quite something, but in many ways a fairly standard AM7. One or two slight modifications, slightly larger chain wheel and so on, but on the whole it's the standard beast. Now we've shown you the AM7, we showed you the AM2 before, but we haven't really shown you any of the features of the bike in terms of how it takes apart or how the suspension works. So Keith is now going to illustrate how to take the AM2 apart, and we'll come in a little bit closer and see he's undoing the lock nut on the kingpin, sliding across the bolt, and the thing unhooks, and it's as simple as that. Into two parts, easily stowed, and obviously you can fold the handlebars down in the conventional way and put the saddle down to reduce the bulk. But a very simple splitting, and in the case of those bikes with rear cable-operated brakes and cable-operated gears, which is to say the majority, there are little cable splitters for that purpose to enable the frame to come apart. Well, now we're looking at the front suspension of the original AM series, and Keith is just going to flex it up and down a little bit to show how the thing works. Coil spring inside the steerer, and there's an adjustable unit, knob, whatever you care to call it, which you can turn, and we'll go in a little bit closer and see that. It actually has turn written on it, or rather raise, so that you can adjust the ride height, and by so doing you can also adjust the preload. At the bottom, underneath the silver and red unit, you can see a little rubber buffer, which is the extreme stop for when the suspension goes to full travel. Down at the bottom, if we move down to the bottom of the stirrup, you can see the leading links, how they're activated, and in there are polyurethane damping washers, self-locking nuts on the pivots, and they can be tightened up or loosened to give more or less damping to suit taste. They can in fact be locked to have no suspension at all, but that rather seems to defeat the purpose. Looking at the rear suspension now, Keith is just going to put a little bit of flex on that, and you can see that it's a rear triangle rather in the style of the Mark III, but again it's refined. So if we go into the unit there, rather than a simple rubber ball, we have a monosphere. There's a curved surface on it, so the area in contact with the cam plate increases, so that changes the rate of the suspension a little bit as you go down. But also inside there, the rubber cone, well, it is a conical section on a metal cone, so therefore the rubber is in shear as well. So it's another example of shear and compression, but in a very small and light unit. Well, here's an example of an extreme machine, if you like. This is a Molten Speed. It's an AM using small diameter tubes and without the usual take-apart feature in the middle of the frame. This particular one was supplied in 1991 and was ridden by Joe Beer. He did several thousand miles on it, and as you can see there are a lot of quite interesting features about it, including the aerodynamic disc at the back, a pair of discs either side of a conventional spoked wheel, and an interesting fast transmission, close ratio, and a particularly radical handlebar assembly there. You can really get down to work on that one. Incidentally, this particular bike was fitted with the special Moulton Volba slicks, a very, very fast tyre developed in conjunction with General Motors for the Sunracer electric vehicle program in the first place, and later used successfully on the high-speed Moultons and Moulton-derived HPVs. And here you are, you're in the cockpit of this particular machine now, complete with its fixed bone, its handlebar stem. Now, one of the things that the Moulton was particularly famous for was the two occasions on which it broke the world record for the conventional riding position. This was as a fully fared human-powered vehicle, both occasions in America, and on both occasions in excess of 50 miles an hour. The second occasion, 51.29 miles per hour specifically. So this fascinating machine here, fully streamlined. You can see there's a streamlined pan underneath, and there's a streamlined top, and you can just see Keith at the back there holding the whole thing together, Rosemary as well. This hides inside it a conventional Moulton bicycle. So here you can see the very small frontal area, very streamlined frontal area of the machine, and it's worth bearing in mind that this machine still holds the record after more than 10 years and many attempts by other machines to break it. So we've now taken the lid off and we're going to have a look inside and see what lurks within this streamlined shell. And there you can see pretty standard AM with an extension to hold the streamlining. That rather interesting furry thing there is, I think, one would have to say, a device for catching the sweat that comes off the rider. You can imagine what it's like sitting in this in a hot climate trying to propel it at high speed. But there you are, a basic, pretty basic, relatively unmodified AM inside a streamlined shell, still holds the record for the fastest machine on the flat, flying 200 meters with a streamlined shell around it. Another variant on the space frame theme was the ATB, the Moulton ATB, which was the world's first production dual suspension mountain bike, and out of which evolved the current APBs made by Pashley's. So here you have a machine which has all the characteristics of the space frame construction of the earlier AMs, except it's slightly simplified. You can see there's a simple single tie bar there, and a simplified bolt or kingpin. Apart from that, it takes 20-inch wheels, BMX format, and that was launched on the West Coast, developed with a lot of cooperation from Angle Lake Cyclery in the Seattle area. And as I say, that became the basis for the APB. Okay, well, we've just had a little bit of disruption there when a train went by and we had to stop filming for a second or two. But what Rosemary has here is another recumbent. You may recall we started with a recumbent reference and we're going to end with one. And this is a machine that hasn't really been seen much at all, but Alex Moulton is with me now and he's going to tell us a little bit about this particular machine.
I started, as you remember, considering the recumbent when I'd started on the Moulton bicycle, and rejected it then. Now, whatever it is, 35 years ago. 2 or 3 years ago, before I'd got into the new series, I wanted to check again and again and again whether a recumbent was the right solution. And in conjunction with some Bath University undergraduates, we had a very interesting project of converting the standard AM series bicycle to a short wheelbase recumbent. And of course it's very easy to do, and a number of people have done so. And just remind me of the name of that splendid man who was very much a maxi enthusiast, who was a great recumbent rider. Do you remember his
Yes,
name?
I remember the chap. I can't remember his name,
all right.
unfortunately.
Well, we'll refer to that later. And I certainly, on one club ride, I was riding with him and noticed, of course, again, it was a converted AM bicycle, and noticed how fast he dropped. And the low resistance, low air resistance of the low position is obviously so. But I came again after these experiments where you can see the very important movement of the seat on the wheelbase. You can see also the movement of the crankset within the wheelbase, and that odd-looking spike sticking out. We had an adjustable pad or that could be angled so that the attitude of the rider could be altered. But the conclusion I came to was that what I had before, that it is not the way, in my view, for the ultimate bicycle, if you like, to go. Fundamentally, it is more difficult to acquire the feedback loop to control a recumbent, and it is mechanically awkward, as you'll see. The wheelbase, it reminds me of one of those things that my friend Isigodis used to say. He was talking about the Volkswagen and the Volkswagen Beetle, and he said, you know, when you do something in the wrong way, like getting the engine in the back, it's very difficult to put it right by degrees. And that's exactly the same with a recumbent. What the hell do you do with that drive mechanism? Either you have it at the front like that, stuck out over a short wheelbase, or you have an enormously long wheelbase when it becomes quite impractical. So for those several reasons, I confirm that my policy for the Moulton bicycle was a classic riding position, and it evolved into the new series about which we know.
So there we are, there's the Moulton recumbent prototype, almost the end of this brief overview of the design history of the Moulton bicycle, but there is one more machine we want to feature, and that'll be coming up the hill very shortly. So here we are on the test hill in the grounds of the hall, and here is the machine in question coming up. Keith Finlay's riding it up from the offices, and we'll try to zoom in a little bit here, see if we can pick up the action. Here we go. And this is, of course, the Alex Moulton new series bicycle. Alex is here today, and he's going to talk about the machine anyway, but this is the latest in the stable, and that really brings the story right up to date.